Okay, so we're going live on YouTube. All right, we are live on YouTube, so people can find us there. And I'll start the Zoom end of things. Okay, so people should start popping in any minute. Okay, there we go. Okay. It's fun to see that participant number is just.
Hi guys.
And by the way, the art behind me is from kids from all over the world from our International Children's Owl Art Contest. The kids are so creative. I mean, like there's karate owls over there. It's just fun. So this year, I think we had 2,740 entries from 49 different countries.
That's cool.
Okay, we'll give people a little bit of time to find us and get logged in.
There's already a question.
They were just commenting about the art.
Oh,
We have so much art, we use it to just decorate the whole owl center. We've got a super huge wall covered with this art. So we like to use it for background also over at another one of our facilities where we do the live feeds from. And we use it for all kinds of stuff. And we have a huge exhibit of it during our International Festival of Owls. But it's just fascinating. And if you want to see a ton more, if you go to the Festival of Owls Facebook page, and you go through the photo albums, we have albums every year, and we usually put up pictures of at least 100 or more each year. They're just fantastic to scroll through. There's just, it's just incredible what the kids come up with. Sometimes it's famous art pieces that they've done a spoof on and turned into an owl. Like one of our favorites was the Scream done as an owl. But there was American Gothic done as an owl. And then every year there's space owls from kids from all over the planet. Owls in outer space are apparently a thing. And just every kind of medium you can think of. And I am so happy I am not a judge because there are so many fantastic ones I could never ever pick. So we staff pick about 100 or more to put up on display at the center for display for the coming year. And then we change that out once a year, but we have retired art professors do the judging. So JF, you said you weren't going to do any snowy owl calls, but you said you could do a barred owl call, huh?
Yeah, after a couple of drinks, I guess, right?
You've got some water that you're drinking. That should count, right?
Right. I'll let you do that stuff, and I'll judge if it sounds legit.
Okay. Well, Joe is our expert owl caller. Joe, are you able to jump in and do a couple owl calls, or are you swamped with Facebook stuff?
Sure, I can. What kind do you want?
Name an owl, JF.
Well, I mean, the great horn is always a good one.
Oh, Carly, you can do that one. You're the best at that.
Yeah, well, I don't have the voice quality perfect, but so a male is more the mellow, low, ooh, 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 and the female, ooh, 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 ooh. But then you get individual variations. So we've had a female with upslurs, ooh, 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 and some males more in the east have a lot of vibrato, ooh, 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 ooh. And we have a male that likes to usually leave the last note off. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Just no last note. And a whole lot of other variations too. What else would you like?
How about a screech?
Oh, Joe, you better do the screech. Andy's our best at screech owl.
Yeah, I'm not as good as Andy.
But you're still pretty good though.
But my screech owl is kind of a
That's good. That's very good.
And then there's the trill.
Very good.
Then of course somebody's got to do the barred owl.
Well, go ahead.
Okay.
Joe, or you want me? Ah, 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 ah! Ooh, 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 ooh! Ah, 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 ah! Ooh!
On the
And then
last,
go. And then
on
of
the
course
last owl prowl, we had a really weird call where the barred owl was going woo 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 woo. We'll just do this woo woo at the beginning, like why?
and their whistle shrieks or their alarm calls or whatever are funny too. So that's like a woman being murdered. And then usually with the really long woo, 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 a couple times at the end. But I've had one that did woo, woo consistently, which was hilarious to hear. Okay, we've got 5 minutes in. Hopefully most of the people are here where they need to be and have found us. So let's get rolling. So thank you all for coming and joining us. I'm Carla Bloom. I'm the Executive Director of the International Owl Center. Here with Joe Severson, one of our educators, and then hiding elsewhere, Andy, one of our educators, is with an in-person audience. And we have chat room moderators over in the YouTube feed from various different states in the country and also the Netherlands. So there's kind of a small army of people behind the scenes making this happen. And of course, I'll get to JF here in a moment. But if you're wondering where we are, we're in a little tiny town, less than 1,000 people in southeastern Minnesota, in Houston, Minnesota, not Texas. And we've been here for just about 7 years. And we started these last winter when kind of the whole world shut down. We had to close our facility due to COVID. And we thought, hey, we know all these awesome owl people, and owl people like to talk about owls. So let's share this knowledge with the world, and started this virtual owl expert speaker series, which was way more successful than we ever thought it ever could have been. So it's a great way for us to learn and to share that knowledge with other people too. A few notes about how this is going to run. We have the chat on Zoom disabled because we have so many people. It would be nuts to try and keep track of it. So we just ask that if you have questions to type those into the Q&A section. YouTube does have chat enabled. So if you're watching us on YouTube, please keep the chat to the topic that's being discussed right here. We will do questions and answers at the end of JF's presentation, and Joe and I will take turns asking JF questions. There's no way we're going to get through all of them. We will keep this feed going for, JF said his presentation isn't going to be a full hour, but we will go for a full 2 hours from the time from 1 o'clock. So it's 3 o'clock our time, a 2-hour time slot for the presentation and questions. But there's probably no way we're going to get through them all. So we'll be picking and choosing, with Zoom having a priority, and we'll try and pull some in from YouTube if we can manage that. And a big thank you to everybody who registered for this program series that made a donation. That's what makes it possible for us to do this. We're a nonprofit organization. We're not overflowing with money, so we rely heavily on donations, and that's what covers our funding for the webinar license and all of the staff time, because there's quite a bit of staff time that goes into this also. So thank you for making this possible and keeping it free so that everybody can watch and learn. And it doesn't matter what country they're in, what the currency exchange rate is, or if they're a student and don't have much money. This keeps it open so everybody can learn. So a little bit about JF. So his full name, let me see if I can butcher it, is French, Jean-François Therrien. Did I get it close?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Okay. So he goes by JF, since most people can't say Jean-François, and it's way easier to say JF, right, than Jean-François. So he's from Quebec, and he's a senior scientist at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, and he's been there since 2011. So he's worked on satellite tracking of peregrine falcons, turkey vultures, snowy owls, monitoring American kestrel breeding populations, and monitoring North American migratory raptors passing over the sanctuary. He grew up just 30 minutes from Vermont, but has been working in the US, but is still Canadian. It sounds like he's going to stay Canadian all the way through. But we're happy to have him here, so I will turn it over to JF. Thanks for doing this for us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone joining us today. Happy New Year to everyone, 2022. It's a pleasure for me, obviously, to talk about the stuff I've been involved with over the years. I hope my French accent is not preventing you guys from understanding what I'm talking about. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end, like Carla was saying. So let me just start with sharing the screen, because I mean, what you want to see are cool pictures of snowy owls and not my face. So here you go right away. I entitled the talk, the eruptive nature of owls. I've been studying snowy owls for several years, starting with my PhD thesis, but I've been also monitoring some other owl species, and I'll get to it. Before I start and go on any other topic, I mean, look at this page. This is the acknowledgement page. All the work I've been doing is team with colleagues. It's team oriented, and we do think there's no way you could do this work on your own. So there's a huge team, and obviously I'm forgetting people, and there, I mean, the list goes on. But those folks and those agencies and universities and groups have been part of the study in several formats and shape, and I mean, all those people here listed deserve to be acknowledged for the talk that I'm talking about today. So I'll come back to the acknowledgement at the end as well, but just so you know, it's not a one-man show for sure. Now, when we talk about eruptive migration or eruptive movement, I'll start with a quick definition, and then I'll get to show pictures and examples. But up until the early 2000s, there was not a clear definition of what it is to be an eruptive migrate and what are eruptive movements. It has been described for several decades. We've seen eruption, huge amount of some birds in 1 year, and then following by very few of them several years in a row. But it was not until Ian Newton in 2006 and 2008 had the nice definition of what is eruptive migration. So one thing that describes eruptive migration is that it is seen in mobile species that specialize on pulse resources. Pulse resources are those resources that become overabundant in one region at one given time, but then in between those times where there's a peak of that resource, it goes super low. So you have those pulse, you have years with lots of food or lots of breeding availability or breeding resources, and then in between you have very few of that. What that creates is a large variation in numbers of individuals from a given species that benefit from those resources. So you have an invasion of those species come in for that resources. And one last thing that was very important in the definition that Ian pinpoint quite nicely is that the fluctuation in numbers are the result of movement. We're not talking about populations starting to breed more and providing or creating more offsprings to a region. It's because it's rapid movement of individual from a species that move to a site where the resources are plentiful. So there's several examples of that phenomenon, mostly at northern latitude. And obviously the crossbill comes to mind. Those seed eaters, the finches and other boreal species will feed on pine cones and seeds from coniferous trees. Those coniferous trees are known to, it's called a mass production. And that happens 1 year out of so many. So you don't have the same constant number of pine cones being produced every year. In a given region, you got very, very few some years. And then in between those years, you get a peak in abundance and you have an invasion of those seed eaters. Phenomenon has also been described in waterfowl where they would benefit from wetland and large plain habitat depending on rain and rain regimes, some years you get a region that's much drier than other years, and some regions are much more humid than other years. And so, like described here or pictured here is the pintail. They would settle wherever as soon as they can find a suitable habitat to breed, they'll stop and breed at that region. So they see those huge eruption of numbers in waterfowl as well. Now, talking about eruptive migration, obviously we need to talk about owls. And just a few pictures of species that are known to erupt. Obviously, for those of you familiar with those species, you get the great gray owl on top, the hawk owl on the left, and the saw-whet owl on the right. I'm not taking credit for any of the work that has been done because I know a bunch of colleagues that are working with those species. I'll come back to that later. Now, the other species that is pretty close to my heart I've been studying for 15 years is the textbook example of eruptive migration, the snowy owl. So it doesn't need any presentation. Everyone's familiar with the species. One thing we know is, for those of you familiar with eBird, this is a screenshot from eBird in 2013, that huge winter eruption that we had in northeastern United States. This kind of picture, all those red dots are a place where snowy owls were reported, and this is not common. You have those eruptions some winters, but in between those winters, you have very, very few of those pins and sightings down south. So those are called winter eruption. They've been going on for at least 100 years for snowy owl. To understand what's creating this, well, we're looking at the breeding ranges of snowy owl. So I'm going to bring you guys up to the tundra, up in northern Canada and Alaska. And obviously, this is the North American map, but the same tundra habitat happens in Greenland and Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. Obviously, and you got snowy owls nesting over there too. So this is basically the tundra ecosystem in North America. It's very I painted quite quickly on the map, but it gives you an example of what habitat we're talking about. This is way up north, northern Canada and Alaska. And our study site, the long-term study sites where we study snowy owl, is called Violet Island and 73 degrees north. So it's way up there in the middle of the Arctic tundra in Canada. Now, this is what we do. Like I said, or I don't know if I said it, but it's part of a bigger endeavor. It's a huge team where my colleagues and I are studying every aspect of the ecosystem. So I'm the one studying raptors, but we have people from the whole group, the ecological studies and environmental monitoring at Violet Island. So we have people studying weather. We have people studying plants and herbivores, such as geese and lemmings. We have people studying the other predators, such as fox, and people studying shorebirds. So all that put together allow us to have a clear understanding of all the interactions between the species. So it's a very exciting group. I'm super pumped to be part of that team and studying the raptors, but how the raptor fit into the bigger ecosystem up there. Now, obviously, it's a gorgeous place to work. I cannot talk about the Arctic without showing a few pictures. If you haven't had the chance to go to the Arctic, try or consider going or look for ways to see the ecosystem. It's a phenomenal place. If it's, the first step would actually be to read some of the famous Canadian author, Farley Mowat. And he's talking about the Arctic and people of the deer. And he's talking about the Arctic as such sort of a disease. He's talking about the Arctic fever, where it doesn't have any effect on the body, but it always makes you, or it always makes you think about going back and wandering in those mighty places. So phenomenal book. If you haven't had the chance, I recommend it. Now, so this is where Hawk Mountain is, Pennsylvania in the US. Like Carla was saying, I was born in Canada. I've lived in the US for the last 10 years working at Hawk Mountain, where we do all sorts of projects and programs from education to science, and I'll come back to that later. Now, this is our main study site, like I was saying, but we have colleagues working elsewhere as well across the Canadian North American tundra. So Saddlewood is one of them, Rankin Inlet, Herschel Island, Barrow, Alaska, Igloolik, and Allard up in northern Canada. So when we have people out there, we can share the information and what do they see, how many snowy owls are nesting in any given year, and so on. So it's a very exciting project that I'm part of. This is what it looks like. This is a typical picture of a snowy owl's nest on top of a mount overlooking the valley. This is our main study valley on Violet. And this is a cute picture of snowy owls. One thing that I like to point out when we look at those small snowy owl chicks is the age difference between each one of them. So you see that in front, you got a big one, and then the second is a bigger one, is as big as the first one, but then you got that small one in between. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but small one right here. And I think I remember from taking the picture, there was still an unhatched egg in between those guys. So one thing that happened is that there's a large asynchrony. So they're not hatching all at the same time. And that makes from a large clutch that can go from 4 to 11 eggs, the first one to hatch will get the first bite at pretty much everything. So when there's plenty of food, there's no problem. But if food becomes limited, some of them are going to be are going to struggle, and this is how they actually have their clutch reduced to get to a balance with the food that's available. Now, one thing we see when you study snowy owl at a given location is that every year you got a different story. So some years you have several snowy owl breeding pairs, and then in between those years you got none until they bounce back. And this phenomenon happens over time. You see that thing going up and down and up and down. Every year it's a different story. Another species that shows similar variation in numbers, fluctuation in numbers, are the lemmings. Lemmings are one of the main herbivores of the tundra, and they show quite similar peak and lows in their populations. So when you put that on a graph, this is from Violet. This is, just a few years of our long-term data, but you see the large variation in abundance of lemmings. When you put on top of it the abundance of snowy owls, well, it's easy to see that, well, they're going for lemmings. They're actually invading the site when lemmings are numerous. So they're quite good and quick at finding a spot where lemmings are numerous, settling in and breeding in that year. And then they can raise, like I said, large clutches. Large clutches is something that we see in several of the eruptive species. And we can come back to that later with other colleagues if they're on the call, studying gray grays, but especially hawk owls and saw-whets, for example. So this is a typical snowy owl's nest at the onset of spring. It's still the Arctic tundra. So you see it's all covered with snow, and the female is able to incubate the eggs. You see a dead lemming that was brought back by the male to feed the female while she's incubating. Now, this is the kind of thing that happens too. This is a picture taken from northern Quebec. I was there and counting, there's 4 eggs, well, 3 eggs and 1 chick in the nest, but I counted 78 lemmings brought back to the nest. So when there's a peak in abundance, there are lots of lemmings. The male was just picking lemmings like they're strawberries, bringing them back to the female. And it's easy to think that every one of those chicks is going to get plenty of food to grow all the way to fledgling age, and is going to be able to disperse. And interesting to note is, because of the tundra temperature, those lemmings don't go bad. They're like in the fridge. So they're okay. It's 4 degrees or 5 degrees in average. So those lemmings are good for quite a few days on the side of the nest. So we've been studying every aspect of snowy owl, including telemetry. So we're attaching a small backpack on snowy owls. It's a backpack transmitter. So you see there's a transmitter, and then the antenna is pointing out of the back of the transmitter. And so when we release those birds, they tell us where do they go in almost real time for several years in a row. So we can track what do they do after they came to a site to nest when there were plenty of lemmings. In between those years when there's not a lot of lemmings, where do they go? So this is a one complete year for 12 females that we track from Violet Island. Violet Island is here where all those lines starts. And you see that some of the birds move a little bit, like the yellow one. So this is the full year for the yellow one. Stayed mostly up in the Arctic, but some of them contrasting pattern, that red one, all the way down to South Dakota and back up the next year elsewhere. So this is the type of behavior we see in snowy owls. If you've, we've marked other species such as the broadwing hawk or Peregrine falcon from the Arctic. One thing that strikes me each time is how constant and regular the peregrines are. They leave the Arctic breeding ground on the 18th of September every year. Several years in a row. Some years they leave one day early. And then they go back the same path over and over again. They're going down all the way down to South America. And if you put all those tracks for 6-7 years on top of each other, they're almost on top of each other. This is totally the opposite with snowy owl. If I'm putting, this is only 1 year for 12 birds. So far we've tracked, I think more than 100 birds from the Arctic and the wintering grounds. And if you put all those tracks on top of each other, you can make sense of it. It's a bowl of spaghettis. You don't see where they go. It's a maze. So one thing that they do is that they go around. They're looking for a place to settle every year. Typical behavior for an eruptive migrant. We've tracked birds for 4 years in a row and saw that they settle and nest every year. Every consecutive year they nest, but in far apart distances. This is quite amazing when you're comparing the dispersal distance, which is the distance between two consecutive breeding locations. The average is about a little over 700 kilometers dispersal distance annually. No other birds that we know that have been tracked has something that gets any close to that. That's so high compared to most other birds. I know some birds that we cannot track yet, like the crossbill, probably have a similar pattern. I know some great grays as well have been moving quite a few kilometers, typical of an eruptive migrant. But in non-eruptive species, birds tend to go back to the same places every year because they know the place, they know where to breed, they know they have a territory, and so on. Snowy owls don't do that. They just disperse all over the tundra every year in search, and they settle where lemmings are numerous. They do the same in Western Canada, Alaska, and Russia. This is from Holt and colleagues. They banded birds and tracked them from Barrow and saw that they were going over Russia and coming back all the way to Canada. And then even, I think, they returned back to Alaska at some point. So the same behavior staying up north for the whole year is not only happening in Eastern Canada. And I know colleagues from Norway have done similar tracking as well. One thing that's interesting is to compare the site fidelity between summertime, the breeding time, when birds in theory should be more faithful to a breeding location. The fidelity is actually higher in the wintertime. Birds tend to go back to their same location year after year during the wintertime. Even though there's a little bit of movement, they tend to choose a similar place. But in the summertime, it's a total different story. They move hundreds of kilometers in search of a place where lemmings are numerous, such as this picture. And this is what happens after all those lemmings. After you've been eating all those lemmings all summer long, you get a large clutch of chicks that are now fully fledged and ready to go, ready to move. And then in turns, you get those eruptions down south. So people have asked me before, and you hear that oftentimes, are those guys just leaving the Arctic because there's no food, so they're all in bad condition and blah, blah, blah. So we've been testing that for years. So we've been showing that the pulse resources up in the tundra are creating those peak in abundance in the wintertime at southern latitudes. Now with Project Snowstorm, with my colleagues in Eastern North America in the wintering ground, we were able to reach out to several people taking pictures of snowy owls in the wintertime and use them to assess the age of those birds. So in big eruption year, we can see that if you use those pictures, in the regular, this would be like the prairies, the Canadian prairies and the Great Plains in the Midwest, where there's a regular migration or a regular presence of snowy owl. In years where there's a lot more owls, well, the influx is caused by juveniles, because when you see those huge eruption, you get a higher proportion of juveniles. In the east, in the irregular eruptive zone, you see that's even more striking. So that relationship increased the numbers of juveniles from lower than half of them in a regular year. When it's a huge eruption, it could go all the way to 95 or 90% of the birds being young birds, young of the year. So those eruptions in wintertime are created because there was such a nice resource availability in the Arctic. They reproduce so well, they're in good shape, and they're moving out, dispersing and ending up at our latitude. So the eruptions we see are actually created up in the north because of an influx of food that helps them to reproduce successfully. And then, yeah, we were also measuring with colleagues their body condition. So the hypothesis was that, well, maybe they're starving, but what we saw is that 80 or more % of the birds were actually in quite good shape. So the majority of the population in the wintertime, the eruptive migrants are actually in a good shape and they're not starving. So the conclusion is that the winter owl abundance in North America is related to the prey abundance during the previous summer in the Arctic. We show that the proportion of juvenile increases tremendously when it's a huge eruption. So eruptions are mainly characterized by young birds, young of the year, dispersing. And it suggests that eruptive movements are caused by good breeding conditions in the Arctic breeding grounds. So now eruptive migration seems to be species specific. Some species seems to be to fall into this background where when they have good breeding conditions, it creates a lot more young, and those young will be dispersing, and then they're going to be invading irregular sites in the wintertime. Other species, and it is thought to be the case for great gray owls, for example, that they might be actually moving out of a given region when there's not much food. And so this is something I've always wanted to do, and I don't have any conclusions on this, but maybe in the future, and some of you guys might have comments on this. So like I was saying, the eruptive behavior is not unique to snowy owls. Short-eared owl, obviously, everyone's familiar with that one, that actually occurs or appears in regions that you don't expect them, or that you didn't see them the previous years, and then they're nesting in huge numbers. I was lucky to see them having nests in Bylot and Baffin Island, which is way out of their range, but it was good breeding condition. There were plenty of snowy owls, and there you go. We had 2 pairs of short-eared owl way out there up in the Arctic feeding on lemmings. And this is not a typical, an uncommon behavior. People have seen eruption in short-eared owl at plenty of locations. Great gray owls, like I was saying, they do a similar movement, although people are it seems to suggest now that the great gray might be actually responding to a different pattern, where when the food is good, when the food conditions are good, the owls won't move too much. But if the food gets lower, then they're going to be erupting elsewhere. So this, the kind of picture that I didn't take that picture. Most of the pictures on this slideshow are not mine. So thanks to everyone at taking pictures of owls. But this is the kind of scene you could see where I grew up in Quebec, where we don't have them nesting in the summertime, but then in some winters you get great grays, and we're going nuts when that happens. Now with colleagues from, I know the folks from Saskatchewan have provided data because they're trapping a lot of great grays. I'm thinking of Dan Zazelenchuk and Martin Stoffel and all that group. And then the folks from the Teton Raptor Center in Wyoming, Brian Bedrosian, Catherine Vura, provided me with body condition indexes. So we're trying to fill the whole year, the annual cycle. So this is work in progress. Maybe I shouldn't present that, but I just want to show you guys that we're trying to assess if the same situation in snowy owl is actually occurring in other species. So is the body condition good in the wintertime? Are they actually erupting because their body condition is dwindling, or are they just in good condition and moving out? So we're working on this. I know folks in Norway, I'm thinking about Roar Solheim that is also studying them, and I think he's tracking movement of great grays. So if he hasn't presented that at one of your speaker series, I think Roar would be a great speaker for great grays in the near future. Other folks that I know have been working a lot with hawk owls. I'm thinking of Jim Duncan, and of course Erkki Korpimäki and his group in Finland on the boreal owl. So they both have reported the eruptive movement in those species. And I'm not going to take credit for any of those studies. So I'm suggesting everyone to read what those guys have written, because there's awesome stuff that has been done in eruptive owl species elsewhere. Now, I've been lucky to be part of Project OwlNet. I am not a founder of it at all, but I've been partnering because they have trapping stations close to where I am, and I have a definite interest in owls. So we're colleagues in banding station located all the way north in Tadoussac, Quebec, all the way to Assateague Island down here in Maryland. Those guys have been banding Samoyed owls every year for over 25 years. And we see the same pattern, the same phenomenon. You got years with lots of owls and years with a lot fewer owls in between. Most of the times you see big eruption, you see a large proportion of juveniles. So this is only the peak and lows in Samoyed owls. And the other graph is the Christmas bird count, but they go in hand. But I don't have a graph to show the proportion of juvenile, but this is a similar pattern that's happening with Samoyed owls, where conditions for breeding are good in the boreal forest. They're going to produce a lot of youngs, and all those youngs are going to be dispersing come fall, and they're going to be increasing the population, and we're going to see a lot more individual and most of them juveniles the following fall and winter. So back to snowy owl. One thing we found out when we were tracking the birds with transmitters is, and it stroked us, was the winter movements. When you look at the map, well, obviously there's something odd with those movements where snowy owls are out over the sea, and they're terrestrial specialists. They're supposed to be preying on lemmings all the time. And here we go. There's a map that shows them spending a large amount of time way out there, 200 kilometers from the coast, and having a good time. Several days in a row, coming back to land 2 months later. So quite surprising movement and behavior that we saw the first time we put transmitters on owls, on snowy owls. And that's not just, some owl. Most owl that we've tracked from the eastern Canadian Arctic spend either a lot of time out up there in the Arctic, but a lot of it is out on the sea ice. So quite fascinating behavior for a small mammal specialist. So now, one of the things we were trying to see when I presented those images to, I was a PhD student and presented those images to my supervisor, and he was like, well, are you sure you know what you're doing? Because it doesn't look right. Just go back, do it again. And sure enough, that's what they were doing. They were out at the sea, and we were trying to assess what is causing snowy owl to spend time at sea. So don't worry about the blue dots. This is just for statistic analysis. But the red dots shows an owl, and it's put on a high resolution images from satellites. So this is in the wintertime. This is as the owls was there. This is the picture of what it looks like from the satellites. So there's an island here. This is the whiter, clearer side of things. The grayish here is sea ice, but then you have those open, darker water patches, which is actually free water. In the wintertime, the Arctic is not frozen like a skating rink. It's actually plenty of opening. They're called polynyas, and they're created by currents and tidal movement. And so those open water patches are recurrent. They're coming back every year to the same locations pretty much. All the time we were putting the locations of the owls that we saw previously, all those locations birds spending a lot of time out there on the sea ice. What we saw is that they're quite close to an open water patch all the time. So the question is, well, what are they doing? Are they going for a swim? And obviously they're not swimming, but they're not looking for lemmings either. So one thing that when we start showing those results to colleagues from the Canadian Wildlife Service, they say, yeah. I mean, this is a place where eider ducks and other gulls and waterfowl in the wintertime actually gathered in huge numbers. They're going on the bottom of the seafloor. They're feeding on mussel, on fish underwater, but then they're loafing on the ice. And they say, well, yeah, we see your species, your owls. I mean, oftentimes they're perched on an ice float and they prey on our birds. So actually, snowy owl preying on eider ducks. So the question was, can they actually do that? An eider duck is quite a big bird. It's even heavier than a snowy owl. So we were fascinated by the behavior until we got some pictures of people showing us. I mean, obviously, when you look at the talon, you're like, oh, okay, it's not, I mean, it's much bigger than what a lemming is. So they can get a lemming for sure. But then can they get a waterfowl like a duck or something like that? Well, yeah, they can. So this is a young bird, young of the year, a snowy owl, carrying a merganser, and it's feeding on it. It killed it and now it's carrying it to the mainland to feed on it. This picture was not taken in the Arctic. It was taken in the Great Lakes by a photographer here in Eastern North America. And so that behavior to actually sit on ice floe and just drift around and preying opportunistically on much bigger prey than we expected is something that's not only happening in the Arctic. Great Lakes, all the way to the Atlantic coast, we see a similar behavior. So all in all, we were fascinated by the fact that they're supposed, in theory, when you look at the book, they're small mammal specialists. They're supposed to eat small mammal, and they do eat small mammal, but they actually also go for much bigger prey. So that comes to the next part of the talk. And this is something we're just, I mean, those results are just, we're still working with the database right now. So bear with me. This is the very first time I'm presenting those results. So there might be plenty of questions. I'll try to summarize what we're studying right now. The paper is not even submitted. We're just working on the morphological adaptation of feet and talons in owls. So it started from the owls preying on much larger prey than they were supposed to, according to books, to test books. And we started talking about it and discussing about it with my good friend David Johnson from Virginia. And he said, well, what about we actually look at how snowy owl feet and talons compare to other owl species? So when you look at that, I mean, it's a powerful picture. And studying that, I mean, to us was very interesting. And I guess if you're a small mammal, you should be paying attention because this actually, I mean, you should be concerned by those talons when they're coming for you. So with David, we were lucky enough to, because he has great relationship with the Smithsonian Museum. So we were able to access the collections and studied 16 species of owls, starting from the small ones to all the owls we could put our hands on. And we looked at their talon morphology and the feet, the measurements of their feet. So we look at all those species that they have, taking very peculiar, not peculiar, very detailed pictures, high resolution pictures of those talons that you see here. And we measure the digit as well to look at the size of their feet and the curvature. So with the ruler here, with the picture, we were able back in the lab to actually compute all those measurements. So we wanted to describe how structured those feet and talons are. So you got the angle of curvature, you got the thickness, which is an index of robustness, how robust is the talons. And I think I have a picture. So here's a barn owl picture. Obviously, it's a drawing, so it's not, I mean, I think Carla has live or real feet that we can talk about later. But one thing that we see is that when you take into account the size of the owl, so all those measurements and ratios were corrected for the owl's size. So obviously a smaller owl will have smaller feet overall, but we looked at the ratio, how long the digit are before the actual talon, and how do they compare among each other. So one thing we were interested is to compare the adaptation for speed versus strength. So obviously, if you have a long digit, when they move that digit, it can go super fast. It can reach a lot, but then it doesn't have the strength of a smaller one. When the smaller one doesn't move that much, but it can actually hold on quite nicely. So all birds have longer digit and talon on their feet, but we compare between species, among species, how is that different? So we looked at the reach, the curvature, and the robustness of all of that. So this is, like I said, this is all new data that I'm just talking about. So the robustness is how thick this is. So it's easy to think that if an owl is preying on insects, because there's, plenty of owls that are preying on insects, it doesn't need to be as strong and robust. It needs to be fast, like speed, and it needs to reach. So they must have longer digit and fast moving talons compared to a fish owl that needs actually to have a grip, to have strength and being robust. So all that together we put into, I'm not gonna go into the algorithm that we use to provide those calculations, but we were able to separate among groups according to what we know their diet is. So here's a quick picture with a lot of information. I'll go through it slowly. So FS here means fish specialist. So at first glance, one thing that strikes me is that it's not that long, but it's super thick. So this is a talon for a fish specialist that needs to be robust and doesn't need, it needs to be strong, but not that fast. If you compare it here with the insect specialist, well, you get quite a striking difference where it's much thinner and it's not that curved compared to others that I'm going to come shortly. And here in the middle, we have one of the biggest group of owls that we have, the small mammal specialist. The more I was talking to folks and exchanging pictures of feet, I had a bunch of, and I'm gonna steal the punch right now, but this is a snowy owl. Look at that curvature. So the snowy owl is a small mammal specialist, but because in the wintertime it turns into a generalist, we call the snowy owl a seasonal small mammal specialist. Look at how this compares to a real, true small mammal specialist. And this is true for barn owls, great grays. All the small mammal specialists have a similar, less curved talon that's actually increasing their reach and the speed that it can actually grab something in tall grass, under the snow, and so on. Here on the left side, you got the generalist, much curved. The curvature is much higher than anything else but the snowy owl. So the generalists are known to prey on prey that are from very small to quite large for their own body weight. So they need to be, in some cases, they need to be able to just grab it and stay on it. And they're not actually crushing it in one go. They're actually going to stay on it and constrict it and kill it over time. So this is a great horned owl, known to prey on big preys and medium-sized mammals such as hare, of course, but skunks and all those kind of things. They need to be able to actually grip it and sit on it. So this actually ties up quite nicely with the snowy owl that has a lot of curvature in its talon that will allow it to seize and grab a duck or waterfowl and actually sit on it until it can actually kill it to feed on it. So much different than the small mammal specialist. So the last graph I want to show is that the whole story with the algorithm that I'm not going to go into the details, but you see that we were quite successful in using those axes that looks at robustness. And here you got a group of fish specialists, fish owls. On the reach, end of things, you got the ones that are small mammal specialists. And on the curvature, you got the generalists right here. Obviously, the one here are the one that are super fast and thin, the insect specialists. But then again, interestingly enough, look at where the snowy owl falls. Way out there. It's even more curved than any of the generalists. So the snowy owl should actually be considered more of a generalist than the small mammal specialist according to its talent. Now, in the summertime, no one would believe you if you say that snowy owls are not a small mammal specialist, because the whole breeding biology lies on the fact that they eat 95% of lemmings. So it was just interesting to see how actually the bird might be surviving the wintertime by becoming a generalist at some point in the year. So all in all, studying the ecology and evolution has a lot of benefits. I work here at Hawk Mountain, where we have our main goal is to study raptors for a conservation context. So if you're studying a species that's rare or understudied or hard to access, or even an extinct species that you don't have a lot of biological information, you don't know much about its diet and habitat, well, just accessing or seeing how the talons and feet are made, you can infer what that bird is eating. So you can have, in a conservation context, what could be the limiting factor. So if you know that owl species in dense forests out there in the tropics, one of his it has the feet of an insect specialist, and the insects are going lower, well, you know that the owl is going to be in trouble. So it's a different way to study some of those species. I know there's several ways to study species that are rare and understudied. You could do playback calls, you can look at pellets, all of that. We're just providing another tool to our great toolbox to study owls in different contexts. So that's all I had. I'm sure you have plenty of questions, because we're still working on this paper and digesting the whole meaning of that. But I'll just end up with saying that Hawk Mountain has a great education and research departments. We do have, just like the International Owl Center, we're a nonprofit relying on donation, obviously. We have traineeship and grad study programs. So if you're a young conservationist listening to this, contact us, send an email. And I think Carla is going to provide my email at some point, or just check out Hawk Mountain website. So that's, I'm going to stop the share and open it up for questions. You're muted, Carla.
Thank you, JF. I think the links, our staff and volunteers are getting those links into the chat in both YouTube and in Zoom. So you should find those links and email information for what JF had talked about. So we have, imagine that, there's questions. I'm going to start with one that popped over here, because I think Joe's doing some links here. There is a question about the current threats to populations of lemmings, since those are so critical to snowy owls. I mean, if there's a problem with lemmings, there's a problem for snowy owls. So what are the threats to lemmings?
Well, guess what? I had a few more slides because I knew that was going to come. Climate change is happening. And then if you don't have lemmings, if something happens to lemmings, you're going to have something happening with snowy owls. Interestingly enough, climate change is affecting sea ice patterns. And we know sea ice is so important for snowy owls in the wintertime. Those regions in red here on the map are places where sea ice is retreating the fastest. And it's actually where snowy owls were seen most of the time. So they are seeing their habitat changing for sure. The same for the lemmings. This is a picture taken from Scandinavia by colleagues from Norway, looking at those peaks and cycles in lemmings fading out for several years. So I know the Norwegian colleagues have seen those peaks bouncing back, but for several years there was and it's still a true concern. And how is that going to affect snowy owls? So because of climate change, when you increase by just a few degrees the temperature, what it does, it creates, for one thing, it increases the humidity in the ecosystem. And it creates those ice crusts instead of having a thick layer of snow where lemmings are insulated and dwelling on the ground, they have a thin ice crusts where their food is encapsulated in ice. And so they're not reproducing as much and as well as when there's a thick layer of snow. So one thing is happening with the disappearing or the shrinking of the snow layer is actually a problem for lemmings and in turn for owls. This is a picture taken from a rough-legged hawk's nest. They see those cliffs, and when they have their nests on permafrost collapsing because of climate change. You increase by just a few degrees, you see a lot more of those events where rough-legged hawk, or if you're from Europe, you call it the rough-legged buzzard, are seeing their nest actually collapsing and they're losing their clutch. So this is a phenomenon that's happening right now with climate change. This is a peregrine falcon from colleagues in Rankin Inlet. There's a camera trap right in front of the nest that records the movement, and the birds is just used to the camera, so it doesn't bother the birds. But the bird now is facing a lot more rainstorms than before. It used to be a quite dry habitat and cold, but now with just a little more humidity, you get more rainstorms. So you see those two eggs, they're floating in a puddle, and obviously they're going to chill and they're not going to make it. So this is something we see a lot more with Arctic raptors happening every year. Another phenomenon, again, the camera trap taking from a nest site on the very warm, still day when the adults are flying around. They don't need to incubate those peregrines because it's so warm. It's 14 or 16 degrees. And in a matter of, I think it's 12 hours, those poor chicks were bled to death by black flies, which is a new occurrence. Black flies don't used to come to northern Canada, to the Arctic tundra. But now with climate, you increase by just a degree or two, you now see they're struggling with black flies on very warm summer days up in the Arctic. That never used to be a problem. Now you have black flies actually attacking small chicks that are super vulnerable. So quite a gruesome way to go. And it's a sad story and a sad picture to look. But same story from colleagues. This is actually from Norwegian colleagues. This poor snowy owl, female, incubating, but their eyelids are shut because a black fly bites. That actually is a new thing too for snowy owls to adapt to. So this female, I think if I get a story right, this female was brought back to rehab center. She was okay, but obviously she lost her clutch. My colleague were actually able to walk to it and pick her up from the ground because she couldn't move and she couldn't see. So those are the things that are happening right now. So climate change is real. It's happening. It affects lemming for one thing, but it's not only through the lemmings that snowy owls are being threatened by those things. So all sorts of things that we're keeping track of, and that's why those monitoring projects are so important.
How far south have snowy owls been seen during an eruption?
Very good question. We always have a few wanderers out there. So I remember that large eruption year in 2013, 2014, there was a mention in a report and several photos and pictures of an owl in Florida, a northern part of Florida, where it attracted so many birders. They had to have some person from the game commission or from the state park to actually kind of help with the crowd because the owl was crowded. Right now, this winter, several of the states in the Midwest are seeing owls in sites further south than we've seen usually. And lastly, there's always a few interesting mentions. And this year it happened and now it was in Spain. So 3 owls were seen in northern Spain not too long ago, which is way farther south than their normal range. Now, we think, like it happened before in Belgium, we think that those owls might have actually hitchhiked on a boat from North America in a port from Montreal somewhere and actually crossed the Atlantic, feeding on pigeons all the way till the boat were in the harbor in Spain or Belgium and actually went to land. But this is some of those mentions way south.
During eruption years, this person quite often sees 2 or 3 or more juveniles within a 1/4 mile square area. And they've been curious to know if the group of owls might be siblings that have traveled together. Is that possible?
It's possible. It's not impossible. The thing is, though, they're moving in so many directions that it could go both ways. It could be siblings just being used to travel together, but at the same time, it could be unlikely because they're just going everywhere. But then I'm assuming the place where you see those is a great habitat for wintering snowy owls because it probably provides cover and places to roost and hunting grounds. So it probably acts as a magnet every year in the same way. So juvenile owls getting close to those locations will actually flock to the same places.
Is the high percentage of young birds seen in the Midwest during eruptive years reflective of the overall population of owls, meaning they're just a lot of juveniles in general, or are the younger owls more likely to wander?
Well, it's a good question. So we saw from tracking adults that most of them actually stay at northern latitudes. So they are very efficient at defending their own territory. So we believe most of the adults at least give it a decent try to stay up north because they're well insulated for the cold. If they can find food and defend a territory, it kind of limits their vulnerability in flying all the way south. So obviously the less dominant age classes would be the juveniles. So they're kind of pushed because the adults are becoming territorial and they actually end up at our latitude. So that's why a lot of the birds we see during eruptions are young birds. Having said that, there's some owls, adults, that are seen year after year in the same vicinity.
Is there any chance that the snowy owls might be feeding on fish?
We have received so many different, the prey item, the list of potential or possible prey item goes from, yes, short answer, yes. Not a typical behavior, but fish is on the list. We have seen and taken pictures of a snowy owl feeding on the dead dolphin on the coast. We have colleagues reporting snowy owl preying on a gray blue heron. The list goes on. So all the things that it is fish is on the list.
With your talon research, have you looked at any of the diurnal raptors like rough-legged and ferruginous hawks?
That would be the next step. That's a very interesting question as well. We focus for that one on owls, mainly because we had a question about a snowy owl being able to catch large prey when it's supposed to be a small mammal specialist. But then after we've done those, obviously we would like to do that and explore what was going on with the diurnal raptors.
How do the snowy owls know where the lemmings are plentiful when they can be so far away?
Very good question. So they don't know. They don't have a map of where to go. And one thing, I don't know if you remember the map that I showed, in spring, those tracks crisscross each other. They're going in every direction. They're not directly going to a place and settle. They're zigzagging around. They're retracing their steps. So they're actually prospecting for lemmings for a month or even 2 months in some cases until they find a place to settle. So it's the mechanism they use when they get to the Arctic is still unclear. Are they just using their hearing capability to hear if there's lemmings, or they're looking at lemmings tracks on the snow, or if they can see UV light, like the study that was done on kestrels looking at small rodent urine that reflects the UV light differently. We still don't know what is going on with the snowy owl. The thing is, we know that they're quite efficient at moving around and settling where lemmings are numerous. We were lucky enough to go back to several of those places where we had track birds, and all of the time they made the right decision. They settle where lemmings were numerous. And at the time they settle, it's still 100% snow covered. So they have a mechanism, and they're quite efficient at it.
Here's a two-part question, more about you. What led you to become interested in owls and other raptors, and what conservation efforts do you do at Hawk Mountain?
Oh, good question. Well, I've always been interested by the natural world. I've always liked to spend time outdoors and study what's around me. I was lucky to do an internship like I was trying to promote at Hawk Mountain during my bachelor degree. I was doing a bachelor degree in biology because biology was easy. I loved it. I still love it. And then I came to Hawk Mountain and saw that you could do that for a living. You can study owls, asking questions, going out in the field, studying the same questions and taking data on them to help protect those. So that kind of makes sense for me. This is what brought me here. And the other part of the question, yeah, so we have several conservation components. So depending on the species we're studying, we are focusing those conservation efforts. So that's why it's important to know as much as possible about a given species, because the more you know where to devote those efforts in conserving those species. So we do have a lot of education programs, school groups visiting. We go out to schools as well. We do talk with landowners and farmers to install nest boxes that provide opportunity, nesting cavities for some species that are lacking those cavities. We're promoting brochures on vultures because vultures sometimes have bad reputation, but they're providing such an important key role. They have a key role in the ecosystem, and some places that in the world that haven't taken care of their vultures are now facing quite a crisis. So we don't want this to happen elsewhere. So we're promoting and providing a lot of information about vultures. So all those aspects we do. And obviously feel free to reach out to me or check on the Hawk Mountain website for more details.
Is there any evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, that snowies feed on the small Arctic bird species like buntings, longspurs, etc., in eruptive situations?
They do in the summertime. Like I said, they actually feed on lemming for 95% of the diet. So there's that 5% that's going for something else. Would it be snow geese or goslings? I've seen snow buntings. I've seen Lapland longspurs. But they're not common. They're much harder to catch than a lemming. If you put yourself in the feet of a snowy owl, a lemming is a slow-moving critter. Look at that! Look at those feet! Look at those talons. A lemming is a slow-moving critter. It actually can move and run around, but much slower than any of the bird species. And they don't have good eyesight. So if you see them from afar, which snowy owls can, and come in silently, I mean, that's an easy meal. We like to compare them to chicken nuggets or hot dogs. There's like those chicken nuggets running around and the snowy owl is just picking at them. So they're quite efficient at it, but they will go for other things as well.
A couple of people have asked, what do we know about snowy owl populations, like numbers and long-term population trends?
Very good question. This is interesting, but we're actually computing those trends right now. We have collected information from the breeding grounds. We're using from several places around the world. We're using all those data that are freely available, like Christmas bird counts dating back for 100 years. We're using eBird as well. We're using all those states and provincials and country status. And we're actually right now working on that, boiling that together. We've been also working with geneticists and looking at historical effective population size since the last glaciation. So we see the trend in population. What I can say, because this is still in process, is snowy owls are declining. The population trends are going lower. It's not still for at the moment. It's not an alarming rate, but it is declining, and we're gonna have to make sure this is not ongoing, because it's going to become a true concern shortly if nothing is done.
Have any studies been carried out on snowy owl individual pairs, and are they monogamous, being such an eruptive species?
Well, that's a good question, and I've had this question quite often. given their movement in the springtime, where you see them going everywhere, it's quite unlikely that they would stick together. I think the only couple, like snowy owl couples that were tracked is by Norwegian colleagues. I think they might have succeeded in tracking 2 couples, and they could correct me if they're on the call or if they want to send an email later, but I don't think they actually stayed together for more than a few months after breeding the first time. So my inclination, we haven't done the sibling genetics to see if they're all from the same male and the same female, but one thing we know is that on an annual basis, chances are quite low that they're staying together year after year.
One person wants to know about nest predation on snowy owls. It seems like the nests are very vulnerable.
Well, the nests are on the ground and you can walk to it. The thing is, you're in the Arctic tundra and there's not much in terms of a threat for a snowy owl. Very few species can compete with a snowy owl. The Arctic fox is actually much smaller than the red fox. For who, I mean, I'm assuming people are more used to the red fox size. Now, the Arctic fox is like a house cat in size. So when they're nesting, they're quite efficient at defending a territory. Actually, that brings a very interesting phenomenon where snow geese, which are usually predated upon quite heavily, their nests by foxes, when there's numerous snowy owls nesting, it's very common to see several geese nesting right around the snowy owls, a few meters away, and you can have 100 geese nesting in the vicinity of snowy owl because it defends from any foxes. Snowy owl don't go for, most of the time, don't go for adult snow geese. I mean, there's exception to that rule, but overall, the benefits of nesting right next to a snowy owl prevents them from being attacked by foxes, increase their nesting success for the geese. So, and beside the fox, I mean, the gulls or Jaegers or skuas are no match for snowy owls. So snowy owls are very efficient at defending their nest. I think the main predator would have been the human or the wolves up there, but they're so uncommon that snowy owl actually are quite successful. When they start nesting, in most places I've studied them, their success rate is way high. It's close to 100%. When they start the nest, they're going to raise at least 1 chick from that nest.
How old are snowy owls when they first nest? So at what ages are they sexually mature?
About 4 years old. That's what we think. It takes 4 years to become fully. It's not impossible that some of them might start nesting at 3, but we think they're mature at 4.
And is that different for sexes? Do females nest sooner than males?
You're getting into too much detail. We don't have clear indication that it would be different, so I cannot say that it's different among sex. Chances are it's quite similar, but we don't have clear indication of that.
What effects do you believe extreme and unpredictable weather events could have on eruptive cycles?
So depending where the owls are, they're well adapted to the cold. So even if it's a blizzard that lasts for 2-3 days, they can actually fast for a couple of days. Being a snowy owls, if they can find a spot and roost, it has been shown in aviaries where they could control the temperature, that the snowy owls basic metabolic rate is okay at -20 Celsius. So they just kind of in their down jacket and waiting for it to pass. So it's not a big issue in thermal regulation. They don't spend a lot of energy if they just sit and wait for the blizzard to go. Now, what is creating a bigger challenge is those warmer spell that brings ice crust to the tundra that might bring the tundra to become the shrubs to grow thicker. With shrubs growing thicker with climate change, you see a different change in the species of rodents. So they don't have the peaking lemmings. You have a more stable population, but doesn't reach as high abundance as the lemmings. So that's what could cause an issue. In the southern part of the range, following a rainstorm, we've had quite a few owls that we were tracking actually found dead because of exhaustion, because of the rain. They get all wet and then they're exposed to the cold, and they are less capable of thermoregulating when in the rain than in the snow or the cold. So obviously, if it's a rainstorm in the middle of January, it could become a problem more than a snowstorm for sure for snowy owls.
Now here's a question that we get a lot. Are the owls that erupt south mainly diurnal or crepuscular?
Well, they are. So it's a very interesting question. Up in the Arctic, where I study them in the summertime, it's 24-hour daylight. You're at the top of the globe, so the sun's hitting the study site 24 hours a day. So they're actually active at any time of day. They can prey here in the wintertime in the daylight. So we've seen them going for prey and hunting during the daylight. The thing is, though, they have such a nice eyesight and hearing capability that they have that edge at night. So if they're at southern latitude where there's a night, they will benefit from it. They'll usually wait till crepuscular time and go out for hunting at night during the wintertime. So yes, they can be seen out in the daylight, but they will basically be nocturnal.
We're probably going to get a little bit technical here, and I'm combining a couple of questions, but have you done any genetic analysis on snowy owls? One person wants to know if eruption could enhance genetic strength within the species. And the second part of that is, are there any genetic comparisons between snowies from North America and from Europe and Asia?
Very, very good question. And this some of the stuff that has been done by Norwegian colleagues, and we did some new analysis recently. We know that on the genetic basis, snowy owl is just one big population because of that eruptive movements that they're moving from one side to another in average of 700 kilometers between two consecutive breeding attempts. That's a lot. I mean, there's not a lot of structure in the population in terms of genetics. So there's a lot of movement, and you've seen on some of the maps and work that was done in Alaska by Holt and colleagues that those birds, the snowies, they actually cross into Russia, cross back into Canada. So there's a lot of mixing in the population. So it's a one big global population.
Okay, this one's from Marcel Gabauer. He says, hi. A bit technical maybe, but do you have any insights into molt based on summer captures? And if so, any sense as to whether Pyle's interpretation of molt patterns is accurate? He's starting to have doubts based on some of the owls that he's banding in Ottawa, but he hasn't done enough yet to be fully sure what he's seeing.
That is a technical question, and hi Marcel, good to see you. The Pyle guide was based on other species, so it was not a snowy owl species. We've seen them molting quite heavily, their flight feathers for sure, and their body feathers in the summertime. The thing is, though, because the Arctic fieldwork is done mostly in mid-August, we haven't been there capturing them in September and October and November. So I cannot say too much about this. The few people that would be, I mean, there's people that know molting pattern much better than myself. I'm thinking for sure Ruar Solheim would be the go-to person, but I know Martin Stoffel in Saskatchewan and Dan Zazelenchuk have trapped so many owls, taking so many pictures that they could talk about that too. But I would definitely try to reach out to Ruar about that. And I think I'll stop right here because I don't want to say something that's not accurate.
A couple people want to know how many snowies you've tracked via telemetry, and do you do both males and females?
Yes, good question. So yes, we've done both males and females. Up in the Arctic, it's much easier to trap the female, and when we're studying nesting attempts, we targeted the female because they're easier to see and spot the following year on the nest, because they're when they incubate. Snowy owl, the female is doing the 100% of the incubation. So if you're looking for an owl, trying to assess if it's nesting, it's easy to spot a female owl on a nest. So there's a lot less uncertainty, but we've done both, obviously. So far up in the Arctic, we tag, I would say, between 30 and 40 owls, snowy owls, mostly adults, but we've started to do a similar study with young birds. We're trying to assess where do they disperse and how well do they survive their first few years. So that's a project, an ongoing project. And then with Project Snowstorm, which is a nice group of people studying snowy owls in the wintering grounds in Eastern North America, we've tagged, I mean, I'd say more than 60 so far. So all in all, it's been over 100 for sure that we have quite amazing data on movement.
Are there subspecies of the snowy owl or just one species?
Just one big circumpolar species, no subspecies.
What would their main winter food be in their eruptive areas?
So they're small mammal specialists. They would go for small mammals, but they could go for anything that they can find. So we see them oftentimes in open country habitats, looking at rats and small mammal. But oftentimes we see them, they like to perch, and a colleague of mine, Tom McDonald in upstate New York, he's a gold. I mean, he has so much information, and he has looked at owls for so long hours. And he would tell me, you see the owls sitting in between that open country habitat over there. But if for some reason there's no food, he just turned around, there's a pond right there, or there's a coast, or there's something. So they like to have diversity on the menu. So they would go for black ducks, mallards, anything they can find, pigeons. It's all good. It's all fair game apparently for snowy owls in the wintertime.
Do we know what this winter's possible eruptions might look like based on the summer of 2021?
So the summer 2021 was a tough one because 2020 and 2021, we were not able to go to the Arctic because of COVID and the remoteness and isolation of those communities. We need to go and transit through a community. And if COVID would get there, it would just not be a good thing. So we've been very careful in not going to the study site. Having said that, we have colleagues from the northern communities that were able to access the study site. And we were lucky to see from high resolution satellite pictures that there were snowy owls nesting. So I was thrilled to hear that snowy owls were nesting. I was so sad because I couldn't go and see them up there. We know they were nesting in good numbers where we work in Bylot Island. We know we've already seen owls in the wintertime in here in the temperate location. So it is winter eruption in the making right now. It's always hard to predict or to say if it's going to be an amazing one, a huge one, or a much smaller one. But we've seen birds in locations that are typical of a winter eruption, especially the Midwest states right now. So I don't think it's going to be a record year, but there's definitely snowy owls seen across a vast expanse of land.
Why do snowy owls like airports, and why doesn't the high noise seem to bother them?
It's a very good question, and that's a study, a project we've been looking at because there's a lot of, we don't want to call them issues, but snowy owl can create a hazard for planes taking off or landing. And so most big airports in the southern part of Canada, eastern or northern US will actually have a crew trapping raptors and removing them and translocating them elsewhere to prevent any damages to airplanes or catastrophic accidents. So that's something we've seen, and we've been trying to assess what is the attraction of the airport. The one thing is it's a short grass, maintained low, so it provides good habitat for rodents. It provides good hunting grounds because it's not tall grass, it's not stubby cornfields in the wintertime. It's the snow is managed quite nicely. And another thing that Tom McDonald from upstate New York was saying, one thing that they do at airport is that they control crows, and crows not harassing a snowy owl, it's a heaven for them. So if they can perch not being harassed by blackbirds, they love it. So they tend to go back to those places to roost. And it turns out that it's a nice hunting ground. So I think all in all, that makes it to a pretty attractive place for snowy owl. Unfortunately, because it creates a hazard both for the owls themselves and the planes. I mean, we had a lot of owls reported dead because they were either most of the time hit by planes, but most of the time actually by the jet blast. If they go on the runway when the plane is taking off, all the blasts come in from the air, the plane taking off is enough to kill an owl straight on. So we were, I mean, it's never fun to hear, never fun to witness, but we were lucky enough to work with veterinarians from University of Pennsylvania, and they're actually doing a necropsy on any owls that is reported dead. So if any one of you hear about an owl or a roadkill or hit by a car from a rehab center, we have this lab that are actually working with us trying to assess their body condition, their contaminant load, their disease, and all that. So we're trying to make the most out of fatalities. It's never, like I said, it's never fun to hear and witness that, but we're trying to learn the more we can with those owls that are actually found dead.
Did you do any studies on owl pellets in the Arctic?
Yeah, too many, I would say. I dissected so many pellets, finding all sorts of things, mostly rodents, mostly lemmings up in the Arctic. Like I say, 95%, that value comes from me sorting through pellets for long hours. We found, like I say, a few smaller birds, ermines. I don't know if it's the correct word in English. The ermine, the small mustelidae that feeds on lemmings, but they're, I mean, just like a small mammal for a snowy owl. I had once Arctic fox cub, the jaw of an Arctic fox cub. So they do take those as well, but it's very uncommon.
Combining a couple more questions, how do you trap the owls in the wild without harming them? And how do you make sure that the transmitters don't affect their hunting ability or mating success?
Good question. So we're magically talking to the owl. No, I'm just kidding. We use all sorts of things to bring an owl to a bait. So we have one, it's not here, I don't have it with me, but it's a small dome cage that's called a ball chattery. So it's a small dome of hard, solid chicken wire. And then we have a live lemming in it that runs around. And there's a bunch of lassos and nooses on top of it. And then snowy owl come to try to grab the lemming and gets caught, and the feet get caught. So it's a pretty efficient trap. The other ones are bow nets. So you have a rounded structure with netting, and then you fold it in half. It looks like a half moon shape kind of thing. And you can place a bait in the middle or put that on the nests. And they're quite efficient at when you trigger it, it closes, and we can access the birds without harming them. Now, the transmitter we put on, there has been so much studies looking at potential impacts of transmitters on several species. The rule of thumb that comes down to is when the transmitters are, the weight of the transmitter is lower than 5%, at 5% of the body weight of a bird is where you start to see impacts on his flying capability, body condition, reproductive success. And knowing that, everyone's targeting to be below 3%, so not to get close to that threshold where you start to see an impact. Now, snowy owls are big birds, and the transmitters we use are transmitters that can be used on rough-legged hawks or much smaller birds. So they are most of the time about 1% of their body mass. So it's like you have a backpack on your back, that's 1% of your own body mass. And the harness or the straps are super slick, and they're custom made on every owl. So they're we've seen snowy owls giving it quite a big pull, trying to get free out of them in the first few hours, but then they just start to live with it. They preen their feathers over it, and the last thing you just see the antenna just sticking out of the back. And we've seen them for 4 years in a row being successfully nesting 4 years in a row. So it seems from what we calculated that it doesn't affect their survival, reproduction, or body condition.
Do snowy owls gather in groups prior to migrating back north?
No, they don't. They're all on the different schedules. Some of them will start moving as early as September, and some of them will stay up close to their nesting ground all the way to November. Some of them won't migrate. Some of them, so yeah, it's they don't gather, they don't follow each other, they just go on their own.
And that's for going back north also, as well as coming south.
The window of time compared to any other species we've studied or we know of that have that kind of window of time that they're all passing, snowy owls, it's a wide window of time. Some of them start heading north if they've moved south, start heading north in February. Some of them will wait till April. And there's always a few stylers in June seen somewhere odd in southern Canada all the way through June, but those are exceptions. But no, they don't follow each other. They don't follow a strict schedule. They're very flexible in their schedule.
What kind of sounds do snowy owls make? Is there a mating call that identifies them?
Oh, now you're trying to make me sound like a snowy owl again. They do have a hooting thing, and I suggest everyone to go and type it on Google. You'll get plenty of owl sounds. They do a beak clapping too when they're mad, when they're trying to get an intruder from their territory. So whenever I study them and walk towards a nest, that's something I would hear them hooting or clapping their beak. And for mating, they have a similar, slightly different one too. But yeah, they're all on YouTube. You'll find them somewhere.
Just for reference, somebody actually asked that other than us, because we were harassing JF, telling him he had to do snowy owl calls, and he declined. Okay, another question. We're always confounded on how to make our biggest impact to help protect our wildlife. Do you have any specific measures you suggest that we follow other than voting for proper legislation and supporting local groups?
There we go. Being involved, being in the know, spreading the message. I mean, you don't want to pester your friends, but you want to keep and share whatever education material to anyone else. One of the things we seem to see over time is conservation's main difficulty is a lack of understanding. Why are those species there, or why are they important, and why should we care? It's just a lack of knowledge and understanding. So the education is so important. It goes such a long way. So any brochures from local conservation or environmental centers is important. And if you can share it and talk to your friends and family, they're all good. Obviously, supporting nonprofits like the International Owl Center or Hawk Mountain is another such thing. Project Snowstorm is another one of them. So all of those actions actually help in the greater scheme of things.
If an owl has a transmitter on it and it dies, what happens? Do you go get the transmitter? Are they expensive to replace?
They're super expensive. So yes, they are. The thing is, they're providing such so much information and things we can do with it. So we can assess habitat use, movement patterns, survival rate, reproduction rate by just looking at where the birds are and what do they do. So when they stop moving, we try to send someone wherever that is to try to retrieve if there's only a transmitter, or if there's a dead snowy that could be assessed, what caused the death, and so on. So we know snowy owls die because it's a normal thing in their life cycle, but we want to know why do they die, where do they die, and try to refine our understanding. So yes, we're trying to make the most out of all of those devices. Having said that, when they die or stop moving in the middle of the Arctic tundra, several kilometers from any community, those are places that it's harder to get to. But whenever that happens to where there's a community or in southern part of the range, yeah, we send people over to retrieve them.
Thinking of the photo with many lemmings on the nest, at what age do the babies start to feed themselves? Do they need to have regurgitated food, or is it just learning how to rip apart the food into bits?
Yeah, so the female will be the one responsible for it, spreading the lemmings in bits just to begin with. So as soon as they're out of the egg, as soon as they've hatched, the female will start pulling very tiny pieces and feeding them individually. Now they're gonna get bigger and bigger pieces until they can actually swallow the lemmings whole. That's what they do. So when they reach the size, they can get the lemming and just gulp it and swallow it whole. So they do that. No regurgitation from their parents.
Any idea how old they are before they can chuck them down whole?
So growth rate, yeah, probably around 3 weeks. They will start with a small lemming. But before that, they're just gonna have half of one and then gulp it, and yeah.
Since we're talking about young, this person asked, do more eggs come after their first hatch? Which I assume they mean, do they breed more than once a year, or how often are they breeding?
They're breeding once a year. They have a long growth period. So if, they don't have the time to start over and recycle and do it again. They have a 30 or what is it? I'm getting confused because I'm studying other species as well, but it's a 32 days incubation. And then, but they start incubating as soon as the first egg is laid. So if the clutch goes all the way to 10 eggs, that means the female will be on the first egg and the first day it's laid, and she's gonna lay an egg every other day. So there's a 10 or 20 day window, plus the last egg is gonna be incubating for 32 days. So there's a long time that the female will do mostly just sitting on the eggs and chicks.
And do they nest every year?
So from the ones that we track, they do. So the adult female we were able to track, 100% of them bred every year in far apart distances. I mean, it's not impossible that some of them skip a year. We've seen that behavior too. So after they've nested successfully, sometimes they will keep on moving, but most of the time they actually settle and do a nesting attempt every year.
When you tag a snowy owl with a satellite transmitter, what's the success rate for tracking the owl the next year and beyond?
So they're quite, it's a great study. It's a great species to study because, like I said, the ratio, the size of the owl, they're big owls and the transmitter is small. So the transmitter don't affect them that much. And so we've been able to track them for several years in a row. Yeah, it's quite successful, the tracking of those the snowy owls.
What is your favorite fieldwork hack using something that's not meant for gathering intelligence that you were using it for?
What does that mean? I'm not clear about the question.
Like shortcuts people use. Do you have any better way to describe it, Carla?
So if you're using something in a way it wasn't intended.
Okay. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, all the things you need to do out there up in the Arctic to, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what to answer. I should think about it. Yeah. Trying to think of something intelligent, but I cannot come with anything good.
Do you get snowy owls on Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania?
No, we're in the forest and top of the hill, so it's not quite a habitat for snowy owl. Having said that, there's some open country field or open country habitats nearby that we do see them in. I mean, they're not common, so it needs to be one of those big eruptions. The last time it was 2013, 2014. Every county in Pennsylvania got a snowy owl sighting, which was the first time in history, but that's not common. So where we are right now, it's quite forested and hilly, so it's not a typical habitat for wintering snowy owls.
Have you considered putting transmitters on great horned owls?
Sure. Yeah, I would love to do that. The thing is, what we think great horned owls do is that they're resident, they're on territory most of the year, and they don't move that much. So it would be interesting to do it, to document it. Maybe you guys know of people that have done it. I would definitely be interested in knowing and studying the dispersal behavior of the chicks when they reach the size that they're big enough to fly around and carry a transmitter, and see where do they end up. But the adults are thought to stay on territory for most of their time, right?
Yeah, so we did some telemetry VHF work on releasing some captive bred young great horned owls. And there was one we were able to track till spring, and it was just kind of a wandering pattern. And although it was raised totally isolated from people, it went to a city for the winter, right on the La Crosse, right on the Mississippi River, and spent the whole winter there. And actually, that was that winter 2013 to 2014, and it was super cold here. And then when the warmed up in the spring, it went north up to Winona, picked a valley there and stayed there till we had tail mounted transmitters, and so they would naturally drop off when the tail feathers molted. So that's, and I think there's been just a couple others that have done a little bit of tracking of great horns, but not much. So another question: over what time frame do lemming population crashes occur? Is it possible some eruptions are driven by crashes in the fall following high numbers of lemmings and thus high productivity of owls in the summer?
Well, we know they have, I mean, if you combine predation pressure by snowy owls, by rough-legged hawks, by long-tailed Jaegers and Pomeranian Jaegers or skuas, and foxes and ermines, that's a lot of predation. So when the snow cover is disappearing, lemming population are prey to all those species, but they're heavily preyed upon. So usually what we see is we trap them or measure their population 3 times in the season, in June, July, and August. But come August, they're usually on the decline and they're going over the winter. Some of those predators, such as the Arctic fox, but specifically the ermines, are staying year round. So even if the main avian predators have left the region, the ermines will keep predating on lemmings. And if the ermines were pretty successful at raising cubs and babies, they're going to have a lot of predation pressure going on during that following winter. So we see that peak in spring. Come July, it starts to plateau or start to dwindle a little bit, and then come August, it's on the decline for sure. So, and then over winter time is where the final decline happens, and then they stay at low abundance.
Do the fledglings leave the nest site out of their own accord, or are they chased away by the adults?
Oh no, they leave their nest sites. One thing that's interesting to see, as they grow bigger and bigger, they're wandering farther away from the nests, and the family stays together, but you see kind of the chicks wandering over there. So if you take a vantage point, you can locate all the chicks, especially when the females or the male is coming back with food. It'll make that sound that I'm not going to do live right here, but it makes a sound when it carries the lemming, and you see all of a sudden they were hiding out in the tundra. All of a sudden you see 2, 3 chicks coming out, flying, trying to flop and making themselves seen by the adults to get a food delivery. So as that goes, you'll see those family units drifting from where the nest was to a hunting ground further down a valley or something like that.
Okay, since the vocalization stuff comes up so much, I'm going to put you on the spot. You don't have to make them. I'm going to play them from the Voices of North American Owls CD. When that came out more than 10 years ago, you can't buy it anymore, but I've got the sounds all on my phone. So I'm going to play them. You get to interpret the calls. Hopefully this will work. Probably would help if I turned the volume on here. Oh, hang on.
Well, that's an unhappy snowy owl.
Unhappy?
I would think so, right?
You're the expert. We're asking you.
Well, I mean, it's so crunchy to sound.
It sounded a bit like a duck.
Let's try this one.
Is that the clapping of the beak is usually faster than that?
No, this was like a vocalization. It wasn't the bill snap.
Yeah, all right.
This says it's an alarm by a female.
Yep.
Alarm by a male.
And they do that, and they would do hoo, hoo, hoo in the bit in between those things.
See, now we just had to get you warmed up. It says this one's a begging call.
It's a very high-pitched sound when the adults are flying back with lemmings. That's similar to that one. So yeah.
Okay, another one. So that was a begging. This is a female.
Yeah, when you walk around and she sees you, she would do that.
That's the call that says JF's coming.
She wants to tell the male some human, some big primate is coming around.
It's not your name.
I don't think so. Yeah. When you're getting too close to the nest.
Okay. That's all I've got for snowy owls.
All right.
I want to say my cats were very interested in those sounds. Are they spotting any snowy owls in Minnesota this year? And if so, where?
I think so. I would definitely look at some of the birding forums or eBird. There probably are plenty of mentions.
Yeah, I think they are. I haven't been keeping up with them, but I know they've been at the Minneapolis airport, and I think some have been relocated from the Minneapolis airport, but I think more have come back. So, are there any studies comparing black fly problems for nesting common loons and species like snowy owls?
That's a good point. I don't know of any. There might be. There's a nice study. The group doing the study on peregrines have looked at range extension, and you see the lines where black fly used to have to occur, and then 10 years ago, and then now, and then where they'll go, at what latitude they will go if temperature increases by that many degrees. So it's that's all I know about the studies about the black flies, but those other birds are probably affected as well.
Bless you, Joe.
Someone says they're curious about the daylight issue. In the summer, snowy owls are hunting during the daylight, which is, the whole 24 hours. What do they do in the winter when there's almost 100% darkness in the north?
So they have capacity to see in very low light levels. They are efficient in the summertime because they don't need to camouflage that well, because they're preying on small lemmings. They're slow and they don't have good eyesight, so they don't see the snowy owl coming. The last thing they see is a big white thing and the lights go off. So in the wintertime, even in the Arctic, there's always I mean, the ground, if it's there's snow and there's the moon, it's still, there's some light that the owls are capable of finding food, and they're very efficient at those low light levels. So yeah, they're doing okay.
I'm not sure how much familiarity you have with the desert owl, or if you remember Mohammed Habib from the conference in Portugal, I think is where he was. He's wondering if and he's in Egypt, by the way, wondering if the eruptive phenomena, things that you were talking about, could apply to the desert owl.
I still have the thing you gave me from Egypt. Sorry, go ahead with the question. What was the question?
He was wondering if the things you were talking about that apply to eruptive owls, if they could potentially apply to the desert owl.
Oh, I'm sure it could. I'm not familiar that much with the biology of desert owls. Owls are, I mean, I've shown quite a diverse suite of strategies, from being resident, I mean, not just snowy owls, just owls in general. Some of them feed on fish. Some of them, the diet is made of insects. Others are small mammal. Others are generalists, and they live in all sorts of habitat. And eruptive behavior is not specific to one type of owl. So it's actually more common, I would agree, with small mammal specialists, but it's not, I wouldn't be, I think it's not impossible that it applies to other species, even the one living in deserts.
Well, we kind of covered this. Oh, we got a new question here. Could black flies become a major contributor to population decline? If so, are there any current measures to reduce black fly populations, or is it just a study subject so far?
Well,
and how do they impact people or other mammals?
That's a very good question. So if a species have evolved to live and nest in a habitat where black flies occur, they're probably going to be okay. This is a new threat for snowy owls and Arctic peregrines and other species which were not didn't evolve, didn't adapt to that. So hopefully some of those species will adapt to it, but it is a threat. It's not just one threat. There's several of them, but that's one of those. How to prevent that? Well, if we need to reduce climate change, we need to start. I mean, reducing the trend we're on, where predictions are for now 4 degrees warmer in the mid of 2050 or something like that. So those trends are quite alarming, because it's going to change those habitat quite strikingly. So obviously, yes, it's a big deal. We'll see how it pans out, but we're concerned about that.
So when the black flies are getting them, I mean, they're obviously sucking the blood, and is that, I mean, that's what's actually causing those young ones that you talked about to die, or is it parasites? Aren't there blood parasites they can transmit also, or what is the actual mode of death, or what they're doing?
Yeah, so the peregrines, the photos I have were from peregrines. They were actually, they lost so much blood and so much probably skin irritation that all of that together make them super vulnerable. So they within, I think it was 12 hours that they were found dead. The people found them dead a couple of days later, because they're not checking the camera every day. So they went back to the nest. Oh, nest is the chicks have died and they don't know why. And looking at the camera, the images showing the chicks all covered with flies. So if you cover with flies for a few hours, that's got to be on a small peregrine chick. That's got to be probably enough to, in terms of blood that's sucked out, and in terms of it's just skin irritation.
And then somebody just asked if vanilla, which is effective for bluebirds and gnats, if that would help against black flies. I mean, do
That's
you get
amazing.
attacked by black flies up there?
Where we are on where we study them on Bylot Island, we're still further north, way too up north that we don't have black flies. And I'm thankful for that because I don't really like the black flies. I don't know the story about vanilla, so that's very interesting. Having said that, I mean, human population have access to vanilla, but snowy owls, I don't know what snowy owls will do. One thing that might happen is that if that becomes a recurrent thing at the southern edge of their nesting region, well, and they get a lot less successful at those regions, they're just gonna not breed at those latitudes anymore, and you're gonna have snowy owl population to shrink towards the pole, like everything else is pointing at. So black flies being one of them. The longer growth season for vegetation, because temperature is warmer, the ground is thawing earlier in the season, so the growing season is longer. You get more shrubs in the southern range, so it adds up to the black flies. It adds up to everything else. So their tundra habitat is shrinking towards the top of towards North Pole, the North Pole. So I don't want to be sad and pessimistic. I'm an optimistic person. We have the power to do this. We have the power to change this. There's so many great positive and reasons to be positive about it. When we see grad students working on those studies, our knowledge increasing every year. We have so many people involved and educated about it and worried about that at some point, that's going to weigh in the balance, that we're going to take actions and hopefully in time to protect those species.
I'll grab one here. So on the wintering grounds, snowy owls, they have a preference for ground that is open over other habitats?
Yeah.
Or do you see them in other places, or just strictly open habitats?
I mean, you see them once in a while in I mean, very, very rarely in a forested setting. They like the open country with a good view around and a place to perch, but that's the typical habitat that we see them in the wintertime.
I'm just answering some of the questions by text, so they're a little bit more specific.
Black flies new to the habitat are probably affecting lemmings negatively also. Any long-term prognosis that this will also diminish that?
Well, it's part of the same story. So you got all those new threats, so it's gonna push those species north, and the Arctic tundra is shrinking.
The questions are kind of jumping around as I'm reading them here. Give me just a sec. So the peregrines, do they have much sense of smell? I mean, the owls, I presume, don't. This is going back to the vanilla scent.
That we know of, yeah, we don't think they're super sensitive to their olfactory is not well developed.
What specific actions might emerge from your research, from solutions for problems for the snowy owls?
Well, I mean, among the several things we do is we try to pinpoint not just habitat use, but where and when do birds, the snowy owl, do they die, and trying to prevent that. So we know when they're showing up at southern latitudes, the main problem is collisions, especially at airports, but road kills is a major problem. If they're not harassed, they're going just okay in the southern range of in the wintertime, but to find ways to prevent collisions at airfields and collisions with cars is something that we're working on. up in the Arctic, all those things that we're trying to have people to be concerned and acknowledging that climate change is not going to kill them right away. It's not if you increase by 2 degrees that snowy owls are going to die. It's not how it works. It works through the food web and all those new threats that we didn't know. So by knowing all of this, it provides data, supportive science and information to people making decisions about action. So hopefully, I mean, we're hoping that the things we do are going to be used in regulations and not becoming a politicized debate as to is it true or not. We want this to help people making decision and regulation to consider those things.
So snowy owls don't have as pronounced of a facial disc as some of the other owls. So this person's wondering if they're using sight more than sound when they're hunting.
I think they're using both. I mean, if they can locate a prey by hearing it, there's no reason they're not going to go for it. But I think their eyesight is quite important overall.
And are people who live subsistence lifestyles, are they a threat to killing and eating snowy owls?
I mean, snowy owls are protected, at least in North America, from any take. So subsistence communities don't target snowy owl much. I mean, this is not a staple food item anyway, compared to all the other things that are available up in the Arctic. So I don't think this being, if it would occur, I don't think this to be a big threat, one of the biggest threats for sure.
And actually, I think the Migratory Bird Treaty Act exempted subsistence communities, like especially in Alaska. So technically they could hunt them legally. But I think, as you said, I think Denver Holt talked to some of the communities and said, hey, this just doesn't look good for you, because they weren't actually being eaten. They were being killed and left. And so I think that kind of, at least in his area of Alaska, kind of went away. And I don't know how it is in Canada, but okay, we are at time and we got through a boatload of questions. Thank you very much, JF, for spending so much time spewing all kinds of snowy owl information at us. I know I appreciated it and our staff did, and I'm sure everybody else that was listening learned a lot also. So very much appreciated. And thank you again to everybody who participated. I mean, like, we couldn't do this if nobody actually showed up. So it's great to have people that want to learn about owls. And thank you especially to those of you who donated to help make this series possible. That's what helps us keep it free, so as many people as possible can learn from what's being taught here. And I want to also thank our YouTube moderators over there. Our YouTube moderators, we have a live feed of a retired great horned owl breeding pair. They don't know they're retired, but they're officially retired. So if you check out that other live feed that we have, you'll see some of the same moderators there. So I appreciate them, and especially Tristan Williams, who we deputized from the Scottish Owl Center to help out with their YouTube feed. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes that makes this happen. This winter, we're not doing these presentations every Sunday. We're going to skip a few. So next week, we aren't going to be doing a speaker, but the next one we will. So that's January 16th, and that's going to be Dr. Jeff Holroyd from Alberta, Canada. And it's going to be on tracking burrowing owls to determine conservation needs in prairie Canada. So you can sign up for that one now. We usually set these up so you can only sign up about 2 weeks in advance for presentations, because otherwise people sign up and then they forget they signed up and then they have other commitments. So we just keep a shorter window for signing up. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, JF, for providing so much information for us, and we'll see you again later. Thanks, everybody.